power node under construction. Red power core is under attack.
Unreal Tournament 2004, one of my all-time favorite FPS games. And one that really helped hook me into PC gaming back when it came out. The variety of characters, weapons, maps, game types, and modifiers still to this day make it very appealing to load up every now and then, almost 20 years later on. Even the box is still exciting to open up and look at. The contents are also a great throwback, especially considering we don't really get this kind of stuff with games anymore. And they certainly don't ship on a bunch of CDs either. Gameplay aside, one of the great things about this title is the versatility of hardware requirements. Namely, it can go down quite low as well as high. With this video, I wanted to try the former and put together a custom Intel build to see how well the minimum system requirements actually perform. Going by the manual, we will need a 1 GHz Pentium III, 128 megabytes of RAM, 5.5 gigs of hard drive space, and a 32 megabyte Windows compatible video card. For the OS, Windows 98 is listed, so that is what I opted for. Every custom build needs a suitable motherboard, and after much searching, I came across a deal on this Asus CUSL2 Socket 370 ATX board in excellent condition, running the Intel 815E chipset. Also noteworthy is the AGP Pro slot, which is backwards compatible with standard universal AGP. Accompanying it is the 1 GHz Coppermine Pentium III and a single stick of 128 meg PC133 SDRAM. Looking through my parts, I also found this Intel heatsink, which is actually too large to seat properly for the socket, but will still make plenty of contact on the processor. For graphics is the 32 megabyte Hercules 3D Prophet 2 MX AGP 4X card, which is based on the NVIDIA GeForce 2 MX. For audio is the budget-conscious Sound Blaster Live CT4780, which does actually work just fine in Windows 98. I also managed to find a compatible I/O shield and a Gigabit network card with Win98 support. This is of course only for network transfers of game and software installers. For storage, it is quite easy nowadays to provide more than enough to make both Windows 98 and UT happy. A 128GB Western Digital IDE drive will work great, and then some. As far as power is concerned, I could have gone with a long-stored older unit, but this much newer and safer EVGA 400 watt supply will be perfect. There should be no unusual risk of capacitor and power quality issues here with this one. With the internal components picked out, looking in my stash for a case was next, and I settled for a classic, the InWin A500, a mid-tower beige 90s case with a bit of a cult following. I found this one in pretty good shape at an e-waste center a couple of years ago, and it appeared to operate some kind of network service with its old internals. Sorry to whoever put this note here, this system has been long powered off, but now is ready for a cleanup and rebuild. The case really doesn't need much more than a wipe down and some retro bright rejuvenation, but sadly I still don't have a setup for that. Sliding out the motherboard tray revealed the only actual issue here. Spiders had their way with this rail for quite some time, but thankfully no one is home, so this will be an easy cleanup. The worst part was the tape on the "Do Not Turn Off" note. After a battle with scraping and isopropyl alcohol, it relented and cleaned up well. Everything else got a quick wipe down and things were almost ready to be installed. While still outside, I hit the graphics card and heatsink with the air compressor since there were still remnants of ancient times stuck on. That blue heatsink really looks good without the dust in the way. To finish up the graphics card, I chose to improve its cooling situation. I'm not much of a fan of not having fans, so this blue LED 40mm one will do nicely. Judging by the dust that was on the heatsink, there was one installed here before, so back to active cooling this card shall return. One last bit of maintenance was cleaning the petrified thermal material stuck to the processor heatsink. This took a couple rounds of soaking in alcohol and scraping with a plastic pry tool, but came out looking more than acceptable. Oh yeah, probably was a good idea to remove the Dell rails from the hard drive, then do a quick test on its health. And wow, the smart data reports perfect condition with 2,533 days of runtime logged. That is about 7 straight years of running. It still passes read-write tests and formats without issue, so this legend shall continue. I formatted the drive and copied over the Windows installer from here. It just makes life so much easier this way. Now, on to the build. First step, I/O shield. And since the case already has one here that will work, I wasted my time scrounging up this one. Every component went in as expected, new CMOS battery included, and I bet this processor is shocked to have MX4 instead of an old matte thermal pad stuck on. With that out of the way, I dropped in the power supply and slid the motherboard assembly into place. Front panel connectors, drive hookups, and cable management followed, though I did get a little ahead of myself here. With this era of hardware, and this motherboard, there are dip switches to configure the processor. However, this board has an easy button for this called Jumper Free, where setting all the dip switches to the off position and moving this jumper to the enable side will allow choosing processor options in the BIOS. For this build, this is more than enough of a configuration. With that set, it is time for the smoke test. Power on looked good, and setting up the BIOS was without issue, so I inserted a Windows 98 CD to boot from, and the first problem presented itself. The old optical drive opened and closed, but was not able to spin up and read disks. All it really could do is this neat trick of ejecting spinning disks, which is amusing and unhelpful. It might be an easy fix, however, I happen to have another beige and blue IDE optical drive. After some persuasion, it worked out well enough to boot the Win98 disk, then let me navigate to the pre-formatted hard drive to start installation from there instead. Windows 98 installed without issue, as did all the drivers, somehow. Even the creative ones. Same went for the UT installer, using ISOs of my disks and daemon tools. After a short rain break, it was time to put this hardware to the test. For the first run, I left all the graphical options on what the game recommended. It's actually pretty hopeful with this hardware. For the main comparison, Deathmatch on Deck 17 with a standard bot count will be used. Be sure to watch the native FPS counter on the top right during gameplay. Not far into the match, and the stuttering is already very noticeable, and even throws off aim and movement. In between that, however, we're getting the cinematic experience, and then some, depending on where the camera is looking on the map. The stuttering does start to clear up once things are loaded more into memory, only making the FPS dips into the teens the most jarring thing here. Going into the heavier game mode of Onslaught on Torlin, the hardware limitations make themselves even more present. Starting off with a super laggy match start. The stuttering comes back, but again gradually stops as the game settles on a frame rate. There's little chance to get out of the teens in this much busier game mode with larger maps. That doesn't mean a win can't be had, however, at least against bots. Back to a smaller map for the bombing run mode brings things to relatively manageable performance again, with the action tanking frame rate to the usual levels. Now to optimize things in this computer's favor by setting every graphical option to the lowest and disabling the rest. You know what? This looks worse, but it is kinda... No, the frame rate is not much better. There is a little bit less of the initial stuttering, so maybe that is all we can hope for. Though, that could be attributed to the game already being loaded into memory. The next trick up is lowering the resolution down to 640 by 480. I was hoping to see more of a difference beyond smudgier textures, but performance-wise, it again is not all that different. There's not very many moments where things dip into the red with these settings, at least on Deck 17. So it is quite playable while looking like an even older game from a different era. Another testament to the scalability of the Unreal Engine. Onslaught mode remains a challenge in Torlin, staying mostly in the red yet again. Let's go even lower next, to 320 by 240. What's great about putting UT into this resolution is this notification it gives you. It explains that the menu graphical interfaces cannot operate at such a small resolution, so it will only put the gameplay down to it, and switch back to 640 by 480 for the menu screens. After going down this low, still only minimal improvements to performance on this hardware. Is it playable though? I would say yes, if you can squint hard enough. The FPS counter is now bigger than most elements on screen, and the text is a charming tiny pixel font. Maybe on a bigger monitor this would be more tolerable. What is more jarring is trying to switch to the escape menu, since the engine has to switch resolutions to display it properly. While in a game, this can be quite delayed as the system processes the switch. Here it is in real time. Ouch. For the next few clips, I just want to show gameplay in a few different maps with these settings. With that out of the way, can things go even lower? Yes. Well, in a way. Switching the renderer to software mode gives things a much, much worse outcome. The menus show up with some visual problems, but going into the 3D gameplay? Yeah, this is far from ideal. With worse performance, FPS, and no full screen ability, I think it is safe to say the software mode rendering is not going to be the best option. It has been very interesting to see how the recommended minimum hardware performs for this game, and starting from here means things should only get better with upgrades. If this kind of build was what you had back around 2004, and this shiny new version of Unreal Tournament dropped, it's pretty great that you would have been able to play it, in some capacity. This experience has been very similar to how my first actual gaming computer build performed, which also had a 32MB NVIDIA card. That system's 2 GHz Pentium IV and DDR memory, however, are probably what made it better overall. Anyway, that about does it for this video. Thanks for watching.